The Senate chamber fell silent as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett walked to the witness table, her navy blazer perfectly pressed, her natural hair styled in a sleek bob that caught the overhead lights. The 33-year-old former public defender from Texas had been called to testify about voting rights legislation, but what happened next would shock the entire nation. Senator Lindsey Graham sat at the committee table, his face already flushed red, hands gripping a stack of papers like weapons. The South Carolina Republican had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the hearing, and everyone in the room could feel the tension building like a storm about to break. "Miss Crockett," Graham's voice cracked through the microphone, his southern drawl thick with barely contained rage. "You Democrats think you can just waltz in here and lecture us about democracy while you're trying to destroy it." The room erupted. Camera flashes went off like lightning strikes. Crockett didn't flinch. She simply adjusted her microphone, looked directly into Graham's eyes and smiled. What happened in the next 30 seconds would be replayed millions of times across every social media platform, turning a routine Senate hearing into the political moment of the year. Graham thought he could intimidate the young black congresswoman from Texas. He was dead wrong. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss these explosive political moments. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know who these two political figures really are and what brought them to this boiling point. The South Carolina Republican built his career as a sharp-tongued attack dog, never afraid to raise his voice or throw political punches. He's survived countless political battles, from impeachment trials to Supreme Court confirmation. Graham sees himself as a guardian of traditional Senate decorum, which, in his mind, means young Democrats should show proper respect to their elders. But Graham had been having a rough year. His approval ratings back home were slipping. Younger Republicans were calling him a Rhino, Republican in name only. The Trump base that once loved him was turning cold. He needed a moment to prove he was still the fighter they remembered. On the other side of the chamber sat Jasmine Crockett, and she couldn't have been more different. At 33, she's part of a new generation of Democratic leaders who refuse to play by the old rules. Before Congress, Crockett was a civil rights attorney and public defender in Dallas, fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. She didn't come to Washington to make friends or follow traditions. She came to get things done. Crockett had already made waves in her short time in Congress. She'd gone viral multiple times for her sharp questioning during committee hearings. Unlike older Democrats who often tried to find compromise, Crockett believed in fighting fire with fire. Her motto was simple: respect is earned, not given based on age or seniority. The legislation they were discussing would determine whether millions of Americans, particularly in communities of color, would have their voting access protected or restricted. For Graham, this was about preserving what he called election integrity. For Crockett, it was about protecting democracy itself. The hearing had been tense all morning. Republican senators had been aggressive with Democratic witnesses, interrupting them, cutting off their answers, and making snide comments under their breath. Crockett had watched it all, taking notes, waiting for her turn. Graham had been particularly combative. He'd already raised his voice at two other witnesses, pounded his fist on the table, and made several comments that had Democratic senators shaking their heads. The cameras loved it, Graham playing the role of the angry conservative defender, standing up to what he called woke Democrats trying to federalize our elections. But Graham had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the young woman from Texas who was about to take the microphone. There was history between these two. 6 months earlier, during a House Judiciary Committee hearing, Crockett had questioned a witness that Graham had recommended. Her questioning had been so effective that it had completely undermined Graham's narrative about voter fraud. Graham had been furious, calling her questions gotcha politics and showboating. Since then, Graham had made several comments about young Democrats who don't understand how things work in Washington. He'd never mentioned Crockett by name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. Political insiders had been waiting for these two to face off directly. Crockett, for her part, had been preparing for this moment. She'd studied Graham's tactics, watched hours of his old hearings, and knew exactly how he operated. She'd told her staff that morning, "If Senator Graham wants to bring the heat, I'm ready to show him what Texas heat really feels like." The stage was set. The veteran senator, who thought his seniority and volume could intimidate anyone, versus the young congresswoman who'd built her career standing up to bullies in courtrooms across Texas. The nation was about to witness what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. The tension in the Senate committee room had been building all morning like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Graham had already shown his cards. He was in full attack mode, his voice growing louder with each witness, his questions becoming more like accusations than inquiry. "Congresswoman Crockett," Graham began, his voice deceptively calm as he shuffled through his papers. "You've been quite vocal about this voting rights legislation. Tell me, in your vast experience," he paused, letting the sarcasm drip, "how exactly do you justify federal interference in state election laws?" Crockett leaned forward slightly, her hands folded calmly on the table. "Senator Graham, I appreciate the question. Federal oversight of voting rights isn't interference, it's constitutional protection. The 15th Amendment." "Oh, please," Graham interrupted, his voice rising. "Don't lecture me about the Constitution, young lady. I was studying constitutional law when you were in elementary school." The room stirred. A few Democratic senators shifted uncomfortably. Republican staffers behind Graham exchanged glances. This was escalating faster than usual, even for Lindsey Graham. Crockett didn't take the bait. "Senator, with respect, the Constitution doesn't have an expiration date based on when someone learned about it. The principles are the same whether you studied them in 1985 or 2015. You Democrats come in here with your talking points and your viral video moments, but you don't understand the real-world consequences of what you're proposing." He stood up from his chair, a power move designed to intimidate. At 6 feet tall, Graham towered over the seated Crockett. "These election laws you want to overturn were passed by democratically elected state legislatures. But I guess democracy only counts when it goes your way. Right?" The cameras zoomed in on both faces. Graham's was flushed, his jaw clenched, a vein visible on his forehead. Crockett remained perfectly composed, though her eyes had narrowed slightly, the only sign that she was calculating her next move. "Senator Graham," she said, her voice still steady, "I notice you keep mentioning democracy. Can you explain to me how making it harder for people to vote strengthens democracy?" "That's not what we're doing," Graham shot back, his voice now echoing through the chamber. "We're protecting election integrity. But you wouldn't understand that because all you care about is what, Senator?" Crockett interrupted smoothly. "All I care about is what?" Graham had walked right into it, and experienced political observers in the room could see it happening in real time. He was so angry, so focused on dominating the exchange, that he wasn't thinking about where his words were leading him. "All you care about is playing the victim," Graham exploded. "Coming in here talking about voter suppression, when what you really want is to make it easier to cheat. You want to eliminate voter ID, eliminate signature verification, eliminate every safeguard we have." "Senator," Crockett's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath now. "Are you suggesting that I, personally, want to make it easier to cheat in elections?" "I'm saying you Democrats." "No, sir," Crockett cut him off. "You said you pointed at me. You said I want to make it easier to cheat. Are you accusing me personally of wanting to facilitate election fraud?" The room went dead silent. Even the stenographer stopped typing for a moment. Graham realized he'd gone too far, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "I'm saying your policies, Senator Graham." Crockett's voice rose slightly for the first time. "I'm a former prosecutor. I know the difference between discussing policies and making personal accusations. Which one are you doing right now?" This was the moment everything changed. Graham, backed into a corner by his own words and too proud to retreat, decided to double down in the worst possible way. "You know what?" Graham shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "I'm tired of being lectured by people who think being young and loud makes them right. I've been fighting for conservative principles since before you were born." He was pacing now, his hands waving wildly, his papers scattered across the table. The microphone picked up every breath, every tremor in his voice. "You come to Washington thinking you're going to change everything. But you don't know how anything works. You're just another social media politician looking for your next viral moment." The committee chairman, a Republican senator from Iowa, looked visibly uncomfortable and leaned toward his aide, whispering urgently. Other Republican senators were checking their phones, already seeing the clips being shared with captions like "Graham meltdown" and "Senator loses it." No. Graham whirled around when the chairman tried to intervene. I'm not done. These young Democrats think they can disrespect this institution. Disrespect the senators who've been here for decades. And we're just supposed to sit here and take it. His face was now bright red, sweat visible on his forehead under the harsh committee room lights. C-SPAN cameras captured every angle as he turned back to Crockett, pointing his finger directly at her in a gesture that would be analyzed frame by frame on social media. Well, I won't take, not from you, not from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, not from any of you. This is the United States Senate, not some college debate club. Crockett sat perfectly still through the entire tirade. While Graham shouted and gestured wildly, she remained composed, her hands still folded, her expression calm but alert. She looked like a defense attorney who just watched the prosecutor have a meltdown in front of the jury. The cameras captured it all. Graham red-faced and screaming, Crockett calm and collected. The contrast was striking, and everyone in the room knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. When Graham finally finished his rant and slumped back into his chair, breathing heavily, the room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. All eyes turned to Crockett, waiting for her response. She took a sip of water from the glass in front of her, adjusted her microphone once more, and looked directly at Graham with the slightest hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Are you finished, Senator? She asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Graham, still catching his breath from his outburst, nodded curtly. Good, Crockett said, her voice gaining strength. Because now it's my turn. The silence in the Senate committee room was deafening. Every person present, senators, staff members, journalists, and the C-SPAN cameras broadcasting live to the nation, waited to see how Jasmine Crockett would respond to Lindsey Graham's explosive outburst. Crockett took another sip of water, set the glass down precisely, and looked directly into Graham's eyes. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and deadly effective. Because you've just proven every point I came here to make about why we need federal voting rights protections. Graham started to interrupt, but Crockett held up one finger, a gesture so controlled and confident that it actually stopped him mid-sentence. No, sir. You had your time to speak, uninterrupted. For quite a while, actually. Now it's my turn, and I'm going to use my time more efficiently than you used yours. The room was electric. Even the Republican senators were leaning forward, sensing that something historic was about to happen. You said I'm young and loud, Senator Graham. You're right about one thing. I am young. I'm 33 years old, but loud. Sir, I haven't raised my voice once during this entire exchange. You, on the other hand, she gestured toward him with a slight smile. Well, I think the record speaks for itself. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the room. Graham's face was still red, but now it was more from embarrassment than anger. You also said I don't understand how things work in Washington. Let me tell you what I understand, Senator. I understand that for too long, the way things work in Washington has been that when powerful men don't like what they're hearing, they raise their voices and hope volume will substitute for substance. She paused, letting that sink in. I understand that the way things work has been that when young women, especially young women of color, have the audacity to ask tough questions, they get told they're being disrespectful instead of getting actual answers. But since you brought up constitutional law, Senator Graham, let's talk about that. You said you were studying the Constitution when I was in elementary school. That's probably true. I would have been about 8 years old when you first came to Congress. Graham shifted uncomfortably. He could sense where this was going. But here's what's interesting, Senator. In all those years you've been studying constitutional law, did you happen to come across the 15th Amendment, the one that says the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude? She pulled out a folder and opened it calmly. Because I have here the voting records from your state of South Carolina, and the data shows that in counties with higher black populations, voters are significantly more likely to face longer wait times, fewer polling locations per capita, and stricter ID requirements. Now, as someone who's been studying constitutional law for so long, how do you reconcile that with the 15th Amendment? Graham tried to respond, but Crockett wasn't finished. You know what else I understand about how things work in Washington, Senator? I understand that some people think that because they've been here longer, their opinions matter more. But let me share something with you about my background, since you seem so interested in my qualifications. Her voice grew stronger, more passionate, but never loud. Before I came to Congress, I was a public defender in Dallas County, Texas. Do you know what that means, Senator Graham? It means I spent my days fighting for people who couldn't afford to fight for themselves. I represented people who were facing the full power of the state with nothing but an overworked lawyer standing between them and imprisonment. She leaned forward slightly. I've stood in courtrooms where prosecutors tried to intimidate me with their volume, their experience, their connection. I've had judges who thought a young black woman had no business challenging their decisions. And you know what I learned, Senator? I learned that when someone starts yelling instead of answering questions, it usually means they don't have good answers. But let's talk about facts instead of feelings, shall we? Crockett opened another folder. You mentioned election integrity. I'm all for election integrity, Senator Graham. So let's look at some data. She held up a sheet of paper. In the 2020 election, there were over 2.9 million votes cast in America. Do you know how many cases of proven voter fraud were documented? According to the Heritage Foundation, a conservative organization, Senator, there were 31 cases. 31 out of 59 million votes. Graham started to speak, but she continued smoothly. That's a fraud rate of 0.00000019%. Meanwhile, the voting restrictions you're defending would make it harder for millions of eligible Americans to vote. So I have to ask, and this is the question you haven't answered, how is preventing millions of people from voting an appropriate response to preventing 31 cases of fraud? I don't think being young makes me right. I think being correct makes me right, and I think having facts on my side makes me right. She closed the folder and looked directly at him. But since you brought up generational differences, let me explain something to you about my generation. We don't believe that volume equals validity. We don't believe that seniority equals superiority. And we don't believe that intimidation equals intelligence. The room was completely silent except for the sound of phones buzzing as people shared clips on social media in real time. My generation believes in doing the work. We believe in showing up with facts instead of feelings. We believe in treating people with respect regardless of their age, race, or party affiliation. And we believe that democracy works best when everyone gets to participate, not just the people you think deserve to. Senator Graham, you've been in the Senate for 28 years. In all that time, with all that experience you keep mentioning, can you name one voting rights protection you've supported that would make it easier for eligible Americans to vote? The silence stretched on. Graham opened his mouth, then closed it. He shuffled his papers, looked down, then back up at her. The cameras captured every second of his visible discomfort. Behind him, Republican staffers were frantically checking their phones, already seeing the clips spreading across social media. Can you name one, Senator? She repeated gently, her tone almost sympathetic now. Graham's silence was deafening. In the gallery, reporters were typing furiously. Democratic senators were trying to hide their smile. Even some Republicans looked uncomfortable watching their colleagues struggle to find an answer to such a straightforward question. Because I can name several restrictions you've supported that make it harder, Crockett continued, opening her folder again. The South Carolina voter ID law you championed in 20, your support for reducing early voting days, your opposition to automatic voter registration, your vote against the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act twice. She looked up from her notes, her expression almost. So I have to wonder, in all your years of studying constitutional law, did you miss the part where democracy is supposed to be about encouraging participation, not restricting it? Or did you just decide that some Americans' votes matter more than others? The room was so quiet that the clicking of camera shutters sounded like thunder. Graham's face had gone from red to pale, and his hands were visibly shaking as he gripped his pen. This wasn't just a political defeat. It was a complete intellectual dismantling, broadcast live to the entire nation. I respect your experience, but experience without wisdom is just time served, and wisdom means recognizing that maybe, just maybe, someone younger than you might have something valuable to contribute to the conversation. She looked around the room at all the senators. I didn't come here to be disrespectful. I came here to do my job, which is to represent my constituents and defend their constitutional rights. If that makes me young and loud, then I'll wear that label proudly. But if you want to have a real conversation about voting rights, based on facts and data instead of volume and accusations, I'm ready for that conversation too. She turned back to Graham one final time, The choice is yours, Senator. The man who had spent decades as one of the Senate's most effective attack dogs had just been systematically dismantled by someone young enough to be his daughter, and she'd done it without raising her voice, without personal attacks, and without losing her composure for even a second. The committee chairman, clearly flustered, called for a brief recess. As the cameras continued rolling, Graham gathered his papers quickly and left the room without making eye contact with anyone. Crockett remained seated, calmly organizing her notes, as Democratic senators came over to congratulate her. But the real reaction was happening online, where clips of the exchange were already going viral across every social media platform in America. Within minutes of the exchange ending, the internet exploded. The hashtag #JohnCrockettClapsBack was trending on Twitter. Instagram stories were flooded with clips of her calm takedown, and TikTok users were already creating remix videos of her most powerful line. The contrast between Graham's red-faced screaming and Crockett's composed responses created perfect viral content. The most shared clip showed Graham pointing and yelling while Crockett sat perfectly still, followed immediately by her calm question, "Are you finished, Senator?" Twitter user, a political junkie, wrote, "Jasmine Crockett just gave a masterclass in how to handle a bully. This is what real strength looks like." The tweet got 47,000 retweets in the first hour. A TikTok user created a split-screen video showing Graham's outburst with angry music, then switching to Crockett's response with calm classical music. The video was viewed over 2 million times by the end of the day. Even conservative commentators had to acknowledge what they'd witnessed. Fox News contributor Brit Hume tweeted, "Whatever you think of her politics, Crockett handled that situation with remarkable composure." Graham looked like he was having a breakdown. House Speaker Hakeem Jeffries issued a statement. "Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated today why she's one of the rising stars of our party. She showed that you can be strong without being loud, and effective without being aggressive." Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who Graham had specifically mentioned during his rant, tweeted, "This is how it's done. Facts, composure, and grace under pressure. Jasmine Forias just showed the country what real leadership looks like." Former President Barack Obama, who rarely comments on day-to-day political conflicts, shared the video with the caption, "This is the kind of thoughtful, fact-based discourse our democracy needs more of." Graham was one of their most senior members, but his performance had been objectively terrible. Some tried to defend him, arguing that he was passionate about protecting election integrity, but the optics were undeniable. Senator Ted Cruz attempted to spin the incident. Lindsey was rightfully frustrated by Democrats' attempts to federalize elections, but even Cruz's tweet was flooded with responses, pointing out that Graham had made no substantive arguments, only personal attack. Several Republican senators privately told reporters they wished Graham had handled the situation differently. One, speaking anonymously, said, "She ate his lunch. There's no other way to put it. He looked like an angry old man, and she looked like the adult in the room." CNN's Anderson Cooper dedicated an entire segment to analyzing the exchange, bringing in body language experts and political communication specialists. "What we saw today was a perfect example of how not to handle a political disagreement," Cooper said. Senator Graham allowed his emotions to override his judgment, while Congresswoman Crockett stayed focused on facts and maintained her composure throughout. The network's body language expert, Lillian Glass, broke down the visual elements. "Notice how Crockett kept her hands folded and maintained steady eye contact throughout Graham's outburst. Meanwhile, Graham was pointing, pacing, his voice cracking, all signs of someone who's lost control of the situation." She projected authority through calm confidence. MSNBC's Rachel Maddow praised Crockett's preparation during her opening segment. She clearly came to that hearing, ready for anything. When Graham tried to intimidate her, she had data. When he tried to dismiss her experience, she had facts. When he tried to make it personal, she made it constitutional. This is what effective political communication looks like in the 21st century. Political strategist Steve Schmidt appeared on the show to add context. What Crockett did was masterful. She let Graham hang himself with his own rope. Then she calmly dismantled every single one of his arguments with verifiable facts. That's not just good politics. That's exceptional lawyering. Even Fox News, typically friendly to Republican senators, struggled to defend Graham's performance. Tucker Carlson, usually a reliable conservative voice, said during his evening show, "Look, I agree with Lindsey on election integrity, but that's not how you make your case. She outmaneuvered him completely. When you're reduced to yelling while your opponent is citing constitutional amendments, you've already lost the argument. Jennifer Lawless, a political scientist at the University of Virginia, explained the significance. What we saw today represents a fundamental shift in political discourse. For decades, seniority and volume often carried the day in Washington. But younger politicians like Crockett are showing that preparation and composure can be much more effective. The exchange also highlighted issues of race and gender in political discourse. Many commentators noted that Graham's aggressive approach toward Crockett, particularly his decision to stand up and point at her while yelling, played into troubling historical patterns of how black women are treated in professional settings. Kimberly Crenshaw, a legal scholar and expert on intersectionality, wrote in the Washington Post, Graham's behavior toward Crockett was a textbook example of how black women in positions of authority are often subjected to intimidation tactics that would never be used against white male colleagues. Political strategists from both parties recognized that the exchange could have lasting implications for American politics. Democratic strategist James Carville called it a generational changing of the guard. He explained, young Democrats have been looking for someone who could stand up to Republican bullying without stooping to their level. Crockett just showed them how it's done. Republican strategist Karl Rove was more critical of his own party's performance. This was a missed opportunity. Republicans need to make the case for election integrity based on facts and principles, not emotion and intimidation. Graham handed Democrats a perfect soundbite. In the days following the exchange, Lindsey Graham tried several different approaches to recover from the political damage. First, he attempted to double down, telling Fox News, "I don't apologize for being passionate about protecting our elections." But this approach backfired when social media users contrasted his passion with Crockett's fact-based argument. Then he tried a softer approach, saying in a radio interview, "Maybe I got a little heated, but these are important issues." However, this half-apology was seen as too little too late. Finally, Graham attempted to pivot entirely, focusing on other issues and avoiding any mention of the exchange. But the internet had already made its judgment, and the clips continued to circulate widely. For Jasmine Crockett, the exchange marked a turning point in her national profile. Speaking requests poured in from across the country. Democratic fundraising groups saw her as a potential future leader. Political betting markets began including her name in discussions of future presidential candidates. In an interview with the Washington Post, Crockett reflected on the moment. "I didn't go into that hearing looking for a confrontation. I went in prepared to discuss voting rights. But when someone tries to intimidate you, you have two choices: back down or stand your ground. I chose to stand my ground." She also addressed the broader implications. "I think what people responded to was seeing someone refuse to be bullied. Too often in politics, we let volume substitute for substance. I wanted to show that you can be strong without being loud, and effective without being mean." Months later, political scientists and commentators continued to reference the Graham-Crockett exchange as a watershed moment in American political discourse. Harvard's Kennedy School of Government added the clip to their curriculum on crisis communication and political strategy. Professor Sarah Mitchell, who teaches political communication at Georgetown University, explained why the moment resonated so powerfully. Crockett demonstrated something we rarely see in modern politics: the power of preparation over passion. She showed that you can be strong without being aggressive, authoritative without being authoritarian. The clip became required viewing in political communication classes across the country. Students studied Crockett's techniques, her preparation, her composure under pressure, her use of data to support her arguments, and her ability to turn her opponent's aggression against him. Law schools began using it as an example of effective cross-examination technique. The exchange also became a reference point for discussions about effective political communication in the social media age. Political consultant David Axelrod noted, "While Graham's approach might have been effective in an earlier era, when only political insiders would see the full exchange, in an age of viral videos and instant commentary, Crockett's calm competence proved far more powerful. She understood the medium and used it perfectly. International observers also took notice. The BBC ran a segment comparing the exchange to similar political moments in the UK Parliament, noting how Crockett's approach differed from the traditional shouting matches common in Westminster. American politics may be learning something about the power of quiet confidence, the reporter concluded. Perhaps most importantly, the exchange sent a message to young politicians, particularly young women and people of color, about how to handle intimidation and disrespect in political setting. Representative Stacey Plaskett, speaking at a Democratic women's event, put it best. Jasmine showed every young woman watching that you don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to be aggressive to be strong. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay calm, stick to the facts, and let your opponent defeat themselves. The old model of political intimidation, where seniority, volume, and aggression could shut down opposition, is giving way to a new model where facts, preparation, and composure carry the day. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a political argument that day. She demonstrated a new way of doing politics that resonated with millions of Americans who are tired of the shouting and desperate for someone to actually answer the questions. Senator Lindsey Graham learned the hard way that in the social media age, losing your temper means losing the argument, and losing the argument on camera means losing it in front of the entire world. The question now is whether other politicians will learn from this example. Will they follow Crockett's model of calm competence, or will they continue the old patterns of volume and intimidation? Based on the overwhelmingly positive response to Crockett's performance, it seems clear which approach the American people prefer. The future of political discourse might just be a little calmer, a little more fact-based, and a lot more effective. Thanks for joining us for this incredible political moment. If you want to see more breakdowns of the biggest political confrontations and viral moments, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. The political world moves fast, and you don't want to miss the next moment when someone changes the game entirely. What did you think of Jasmine Crockett's performance? Was this the perfect way to handle a political bully, or should she have responded different? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one and love hearing from you.